Hey guys, welcome to the skeletal system handout for human biology. So to get started, the skeletal system can be subdivided into two categories, the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. And the name should sort of give them away. The axial referring to down the axis. This includes the skull, the vertebral column, the ribs, and the sacrum and the coccyx. Those parts belong to the axial skeleton because they sort of go down the axis. All other bones belong to the appendicular subdivision. So the legs are appendicular, the arms are appendicular, but also the scapula is appendicular. And how do you remember that? Well, it's attached to the arm, and the arm is appendicular, so the scapula is appendicular. And there's another bone anterior here, that's the clavicle. And the clavicle is attached to the arm, so the clavicle is appendicular. The scapula is also appendicular. And as we know, the leg bone is appendicular. So again, the hip bone, the pelvis, is attached to the leg, and the leg is appendicular. And that makes the hip bone appendicular as well. So the bones, you could kind of think of it as the bones that are attached to the arm or leg are also appendicular. The scapula, the clavicle, the scapula, and the pelvis, all three of those are attached to an arm or a leg, and therefore those belong to the appendicular skeleton. So again, what do you think? Let's review here. What do you think? The skull, axial or appendicular? The answer is axial. This is a clavicle, appendicular. Where do you think the hip bones? The hip bones belong to appendicular. Scapula, appendicular. Clavicle, appendicular. How about the vertebral column? Axial. The ribs are axial. The sacrum and coccyx, axial. The arm bones, appendicular. And that sort of that really takes care of all 206 bones. Now you should be able to put all 206 bones into one of those two subdivisions, axial or appendicular. So the skeleton also, another thing that's important to note is that it's the skeletal system is a great storage place for calcium and phosphorus. When we don't take in enough calcium for the day, we get our calcium from the bone. And when we take in more than we need for the day, calcium gets deposited into the bone. So it's sort of a calcium storage area, the bones. We also have compact bone and spongy bone, depending on what it looks like. And all of our bones, all the way around our body, we always have this compact bone, and it's always like the outer shell. Some of our bones also have this spongy bone. Why is it called spongy bone? It's called spongy bone because it looks like a sponge. It's just as hard. It doesn't like squish or anything. It's just as hard as compact, but because there's a lot of air sacs, sacs filled with blood, it looks spongy, so we call it spongy. So the next section is organizing all 206 bones according to their shape. We got long bones, flat bones, short bones, irregular bones, sesamoid, and sutural. So the question is, can you put all 206 into one of those 6 shapes? Well, long bones they're typically longer than they are wide. They're very much cylindrical, like a pipe. So that, in other words, they can take axial compression very well. And those are found in the leg. They're found in the arm. The fingers, your fingers and your toes, and your metacarpals and your metatarsals in the feet, those are all long bones. So it's not really how long a bone is, it's just the shape of it. How much longer is it than it is wide. This is a long bone. This is a long bone. However, your clavicle doesn't really fit the description, and the reason why is because it sort of has this flat end, and so we call the clavicle a flat bone. The clavicle is a flat bone. However, your phalanges, your metacarpals, the humerus, the tibia, the fibula, these are all examples of long bones. In the feet, your phalanges or your metatarsals, these are long bones. These are all the long bones of the body. We also have flat bones. Flat bones they can sort of bend like your ribs. Otherwise, you wouldn't even be able to do CPR, for example. You wouldn't be able to do chest compressions if your ribs were long and not flat. They're flat bones. The sternum is flat. Your clavicle is flat. These are all flat bones. And you can they're pretty obvious, aren't they? Pretty much everything in the chest seems to be a flat bone. Your ribs are flat. Your clavicle is flat. The manubrium is flat. The body is flat. The xiphoid process is flat. These are all flat bones. Now we have another flat bone, and that's the cranial bones. The cranial bones are all flat. And that's true because although overall it looks like a big round ball, if you were to cut out a piece of the skull, you'd find that it's flat like a sheet of paper. Those are all flat bones. A bone that will sort of throw you off is the hip bone. The hip bone is actually not a flat bone. The hip bone is actually irregular, and the reason why is because it has this big hole in the middle here, this obturator foramen, and so the hip bone is actually irregular. However, the scapula is a flat bone. The manubrium is flat. The body is flat. The xiphoid process is flat. All three of these regions is the sternum. The ribs are flat. The scapula is flat. The clavicle is flat. Those are flat bones. We also have short bones. These are found in the wrist and they're found in the ankle. These here pretty much are all short bones. Now, if we turn the hand around, we'll find that there is actually one bone that is in the wrist that's actually not a short bone. It's this sesamoid, right? It's this pisiform right here. This pisiform right here is actually sesame shape, so it's a sesamoid bone. So we have one over here, we have one on this side, and then our two patellae here are also sesamoid. So we have flat bones, we have long bones, and we have sesamoid bones. And we also have irregular bones. Irregular bones they sort of don't really fit in any other shape. And that includes your vertebrae, all of the vertebral column, all of these bones, all these vertebrae are irregular bones. Your hip bones, your pelvis is also irregular. These are your irregular bones. And the last shape bone are the sutural bones. Now, if I were to draw in these sutures here, sometimes a suture, as these bones grow, they don't meet perfectly in the middle and end up sort of forming an extra little suture, extra little crack. Well, that means that forms in a tiny little bone. That's a sutural bone. So if I were to do it again here, for example, another little crack or suture, now we got two little sutural bones. We're not going to call that a frontal bone. We're not going to call it a parietal bone. We're not going to call it occipital bone. We call them sutural bones. So that's the sixth and final shape of bone. And that sort of concludes the 6 shapes of bones. Again, we have flat bones, like your ribs, long bones, like the humerus. We have irregular bones, like the hip bone, sesamoid, like the patella, short bones, like your carpals, and we have sutural, like the ones that are found between the sutures of the skull. Those are the 6 shaped bones. Let's take the anatomy of a long bone. A long bone has a kind of like a really long, skinny part, and that's called the diaphysis. And the expanded ends are called epiphyses. One is called an epiphysis. So you have the diaphysis going down the length of the bone, and then at the ends is the epiphyses. We're all used to seeing as kids a cartoon doggy bone shaped kind of bone. So this here would be the diaphysis, and these on the ends would be the epiphyses. Okay, very good. The next category that we're going to talk about here is the difference between an epiphyseal line and an epiphyseal plate. Now, when we're still in our embryological stages, our bones are actually not bones. They're actually cartilage, and they turn into bone cells. Our cartilage cells turn into bone cells. And so the cartilage is replaced by bone. So the blue that you see here is actually cartilage. And little by little, these cartilaginous cells turn into bone cells. You see them forming here at the ends and in the middle. Eventually, all you have left over is a little bit of cartilage here. Excuse me. And a little bit of articular cartilage on the ends. These are all hyaline cartilage, by the way. Well, the cartilage that you see right in here, this is actually called an epiphyseal plate. These are your growth plates. This cartilage here allows you to grow in length. This is what allows you to grow taller and taller. And as you get older, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, eventually all of these cartilaginous cells also get replaced by bone. And when that happens, you have what's left over. It's called the epiphyseal line. It's the remnant. It's what's left over. It turns into bone. It's all replaced by bone. And when that happens, you now have an epiphyseal line, and that epiphyseal line, like you see here, is just composed of bone. There's no cartilage left. The only cartilage then as an adult that you would have is at the very, very ends of the bone, made out of hyaline cartilage. It's this articular cartilage, and this is what will allow our joints to move. And now, once you've gone from an epiphyseal line to an epiphyseal plate to an epiphyseal line, you have now stopped growing, and that's what you see in adults. That's the difference. The next piece is the difference between your cranial bones and your facial bones. Now, in lab, we'll see the cranial bones: frontal bone, occipital bone, ethmoid, sphenoid, parietal, temporal. We won't really get into the facial bones all that much. So if you see, on a lecture exam question, for example, any of these that you don't really recognize, it's most likely going to be a facial bone. Whereas we will go through the frontal bone, occipital bone. These are the bones of the cranium. So there's just be aware that there's facial bones, and then you have cranial bones. So you see here, these are the cranial bones, but these here are the facial bones. Here's the sphenoid, by the way. All this is the sphenoid. This purplish, pinkish. Your ethmoid is right here. You can see a little bit of the ethmoid right up in there too. The hyoid is the only bone that doesn't articulate with any other bone. It's called the hyoid bone. Now, the second to the last thing that I wanted to cover is the four curvatures of the spine, the four curvatures of the vertebral column. And if we take you take a blank sheet of paper and you draw this out, and you sort of separate these like so. The very top curve is your cervical curve. And the next curve is your thoracic curve. The third one is your lumbar curve. And finally, the last one is your sacral curve. So the question is, well, which way is this person facing? Forward or left to the right? This person is facing to the right, and I know that because their head would be, this cervical curve allows them to, sort of look up. And this is sort of where your butt is. This is the, you know, your butt is shaped partly due to the sacral curve, and this is the you know, the bottom of your back, the lumbar curve, and then your sacral curve. Well, we have primary curves and we have secondary curves. The primary curves are called primary because you are already born with them. They're already formed when you're born. So this is what you look like as a baby. This is the curve of your entire back. And that's if you're, you know, that's supposed to be a nose there. Okay, there we go. That's if you're facing this way. You're still facing the same direction here. And so you have like the cervical part, the thoracic, the lumbar, the sacral. And so you see the shape of this curve, how it's convex on this side, but concave on this side. That's the same as the thoracic and the lumbar, and the sacral. So these two curves you have when you're born, and so these are primary curves. But the cervical curve and the lumbar curve form later on, and therefore we call them secondary curves. Primary and secondary. So how old are you when the thoracic is formed? You're 0. You're 0 years old. You're 0 years old. When you're able to look up, your cervical curve starts to form, roughly at 6 months. And what about when you start to stand up and walk? How old are you? Roughly 12 months. And when you can do that, your lumbar curve starts to develop because you start to walk. Roughly at 12 months, roughly at a year. And that concludes what I want you to know as far as the curves of the spine. You have primary curves, secondary curves, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. And the secondary curves form later on at 6 months for your head, for you to be able to look up, balance, and for you to be able to stand up and walk is your lumbar, roughly at 12. The last thing is being able to tell the difference between once you have your pelvic girdle. So when you have your two hip bones together, it's called all together. This is called a pelvic girdle. And you can tell a male from a female based on what we call the pubic arch. If the pubic arch is acute or less than 90 degrees, that would indicate that this is a male pelvis coming from a male person. And if the pubic arch is obtuse or greater than 90 degrees, you have a female. That's one way of telling a male from a female, is looking at the pubic arch. All right, thank you guys very much. That concludes the everything that you got to know for the skeletal handout. Thank you very much. Study up, and we'll see you next time.